I woke up on Tuesday the same way I always wake up, before the sun fully decides it's going to show up. Eyes open on instinct, the kind of instinct you don't lose after 22 years in the Navy Seabees, when morning means tools, plans, and consequences, not comfort. And I remember shuffling into my kitchen in a worn bathrobe, pouring coffee that was too strong because that's how I like it, stepping onto my porch expecting the usual quiet soundtrack of Silvercrest pines, sprinklers clicking. In the distance, a couple birds arguing over nothing, the faint hum of traffic far enough away that it felt like a different life. Then I looked toward my front line of hedges and my brain didn't register what I was seeing for a full second, because the hedge wall that had stood there like a green barricade, the one I built and nursed and trimmed every Saturday like it was a prayer, the one that held my private grief behind it, was simply gone, not trimmed, not improved, not opened up, but erased, chainsawed down to 6-inch stumps, the branches piled like a botched funeral pyre, with chips scattered across my driveway, and diesel exhaust from 2 chippers hanging in the air, so thick it dragged old memories back into my throat. There were 3 workers in matching landscaping uniforms feeding what used to be my hedge into a machine that screamed like metal having a panic attack, and standing to the side, clean shoes, clean hair, clean hands, holding a clipboard like she'd been born with it, was Genevieve Lockhartvale, the chair of the Architectural Review Committee for the Silvercrest Pines Association, a woman who could make "How Lovely" sound like a warning. Pearl white SUV in the street like it was parked on a red carpet, and that smile that always made me feel like I should pat my pockets and make sure my dignity was still there. I didn't scream, I didn't rush at anyone, because anger burns hot and fast, and then leaves you empty. And I've been empty before, I know what it costs, so I stood there with my coffee mug, staring at the stumps, staring at the churned dirt behind them. And that's when I saw what they didn't even know they'd uncovered: torn roots, snapped stems, dark soil scattered with the remains of 3 rose bushes I had planted beneath that hedge line. One for each man I lost overseas: Rodriguez, Hale, Whitman, my Afghan brothers who never made it home to argue with anyone about property values or magazine features. And for a moment, I felt something in my chest go still, not rage, not sorrow, but a cold, strategic calm, the kind that hits you when someone has just declared war on sacred ground, without realizing you're the type of man who knows how to build wars into walls. The crew chief, a sunburned guy with tired eyes, walked over and held out a crumpled work order like it might protect him, and I could see the way his hands shook because even he understood this felt wrong. And the paper said, "Emergency removal, sightline violation," signed by Genevieve Lockhartvale in clean, bold strokes, like she was signing autographs. And she didn't even look at the roses. She didn't even acknowledge the torn roots. She just said something about the entrance aesthetic and community standards and how the hedge obstructed the scenic line. And I remember thinking, that phrase, scenic line, was the kind of thing people say when they've never had to stand in front of a flag-draped casket, the kind of thing people say when they've never had to learn a man's name because he didn't come home. My name is Ethan Tank Calder, and the nickname stuck because I could weld a patch in 30-foot swells without flinching, because when things broke in the middle of nowhere, you didn't complain, you built, you fixed, you adapted. And after my divorce, when the big house went to my ex-wife and the nice cars went with it, and half my pension went into a monthly payment that kept my ramen budget tight, I ended up in Silvercrest Pines on a corner lot near the main entrance, prime real estate if you're a developer, annoying real estate if you're anyone else, wedged between a retention pond and a utility easement, sightline challenges, they called it, which was just fancy language for, we can't sell a mansion here. And for me that meant peace, because I didn't want a mansion, I wanted a corner of the world where nobody bothered me, where I could build something that didn't explode or collapse or get argued over in court. So I built that hedge wall, mixed privet, holly, and cherry laurel, and I babied it through drought and one nasty ice storm. And every Saturday I walked the line with coffee, the snip-click of pruning shears becoming my meditation, because plants taught me patience in ways steel never did. And beneath it I planted those roses, not because I wanted attention, but because I needed somewhere to put names that still lived in my mouth. By noon, the missing piece landed like a punchline that wasn't funny, because the owner of the landscaping company, Carlos Mendez, called me back after I left messages that probably didn't belong in a family neighborhood. and he sounded like a decent man who hated the position he was in. And he said, "Tank, I'm sorry, we just follow work orders. But this one was weird. Rush job, paid cash up front. And she was real specific about doing it today while you were supposedly out of town." And then he added the part that turned my stomach. There was a photographer there, professional setup, reflectors, big camera, kept telling us to position the chipper for better angles. That's when the truth clicked into place with a clean mechanical snap. This wasn't random enforcement. This was staging. They wanted the entrance to Silvercrest Pines photographed for a magazine feature, and my hedge wall was in the way of their scenic shot. So they chainsawed it like it didn't belong to a human being, like it wasn't sheltering a memorial, like it wasn't 3 years of my hands and my Saturdays and my quiet healing. And in that moment I didn't think, I'll call a lawyer and plead for justice, because I've seen justice get delayed until it dies, and I wasn't going to beg a clipboard queen for mercy. I was going to build something that made begging unnecessary. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived like salt ground into an open wound, titled Notice of Architectural Compliance Achievement, congratulating me for improvements to my property, as if I'd asked for my hedge to be murdered, and included a glossy brochure of approved plants conveniently available through Vale Design Group, which, no shock, belonged to Genevieve Lockhart Vale, with a quote for complimentary entrance landscaping at $8,500. And the final paragraph was the real tell. The quiet threat dressed as policy, warning that any unauthorized structures or landscaping installed without committee approval would be subject to immediate removal and associated fees. And I sat there reading it with my coffee going cold and thought, so that's the game. Break my property, then sell me the cure. Punish me if I don't buy the cure. Rinse, repeat, profit. My insurance company confirmed what most people learn too late. Landscaping isn't covered unless you add it specifically, which meant I was out the money, the plants, the labor, and the memorial. So I did what I always do when someone thinks they can win by intimidating me. I gathered intelligence. I started attending board meetings, the same meetings I'd avoided because life's too short for bureaucratic theater. And I watched Genevieve run the room like a kingdom, gavel cracking like a judge, community vision dripping from her mouth like perfume. And I learned about the Silvercrest Pines Beautification Initiative, a $200,000 project funded by a special assessment, meant to enhance property values through strategic landscaping. And I learned the funniest part. The landscaping contract went to Vale Design Group, and the board approved it. And suddenly my hedge wasn't a hedge anymore. It was an obstacle to someone's revenue stream. So I requested the meeting minutes, because minutes don't lie even when people do. And buried in an October entry was a line that made me laugh the way you laugh when you realize the villain is sloppy. Motion to designate Lot 47 as Community Gateway Enhancement Zone, meaning my property, my corner lot, had been casually labeled part of their project, without my consent, without notice, and in a closed session that violated open meeting laws, because in most states, HOAs have to vote in public when decisions affect an individual homeowner's rights. And suddenly, I could see the first crack in their armor, the kind of crack you can widen if you know where to hit. Then Dorothy Hensley, a sweet older woman from across the street with the soul of a retired spy, brought me old plat maps and surveys from before the development existed, and she spread them on my workbench like treasure. ND, she pointed to my lot line and said, "Honey, your corner lot isn't shaped how they say it is." And when I leaned in and traced the boundary, my stomach dropped in the best way, because my land extended 12 feet further toward the entrance than anyone remembered. And the big fancy fountain the HOA loved to feature in photos, the one they bragged about in newsletters, the one they used as the crown of their entrance experience, sat on my property. No easement, no lease, no permission, just sitting there like a stolen trophy. And the twist got sweeter, because the original environmental impact study for the county had designated my whole corner area as a protected buffer zone, a natural screen between residential streets and the highway, tied to development incentives and, according to Dorothy's paperwork, even federal infrastructure grant conditions, which meant any significant removal of established vegetation required county approval and notice. And if the HOA destroyed my hedge wall in that zone without authorization, they didn't just hurt me, they potentially triggered a compliance review that could cost the entire development a fortune. I didn't tell anyone yet, because you don't reveal the strongest card until the table is ready. 2 weeks later, Genevieve tried her next squeeze. An orange violation notice stapled to my door about unapproved storage of industrial materials, because 6 shipping containers had been delivered to my driveway, waiting for placement, and she gave me 72 hours to remove them or face $200 per day in fines, because she understood what moving containers costs. She understood I couldn't casually drop thousands on cranes and transport. She wanted to force me into violation status, then lien, then control. Instead, I pulled permits. I called the county building department and applied for a construction permit for temporary environmental screening structures incorporating recycled shipping containers. And county code had no rule against it as long as setbacks were respected, and my weird angled lot gave me room, and the buffer designation gave me a reason, because protecting delicate plantings from wind and road pollution was a legitimate environmental purpose. So I planted a vegetable garden and a small food forest. Layout to anchor my agricultural exemption, because my deed still carried an old agricultural grandfather clause from before the land was subdivided, and that clause meant certain HOA architectural restrictions didn't apply if I maintained productive use, and the irony tasted better than any fertilizer. Then the fortress began. I positioned the 6 containers at calculated angles, not random, never random, using the kind of funnel design we used in overseas bases, narrow entry, forced direction, points of no return, and as I welded, sparks flying into the evening air, steel pinging as it cooled, I felt that familiar calm, because building is therapy when you don't trust words. And I built a one-way path that looked like visitor parking access, signs placed like breadcrumbs, and a weighted gate system triggered by vehicle pressure. Drive in. The gate swings shut behind you, and the only way out is forward through an exit deliberately too narrow for anything bigger than a golf cart. While I built, Genevieve escalated with lawyers, Bradford and Klein Legal Group, sending letters thick with threats about property devaluation, and she filed county complaints accusing me of safety hazards, salvage yards, blocked sight lines, and she tried for a restraining order to freeze construction, and every time she fired, I fired back. Environmental complaints about the fountain's unauthorized construction on my land, violations of the buffer zone, documentation of my hedges destroyed, without notice. And then Carlos Mendez called again, voice tight, and he said words that turned my case from civil to criminal. Tank, she approached me about sabotaging your containers. She wanted me to accidentally damage them during routine maintenance, make it look like equipment malfunction. She offered cash, and I recorded it. Intent documented. Conspiracy documented. And that's when I knew exactly how this would end. December 15th, crisp morning, I sat on my porch with coffee like a man watching weather roll in, because I knew the storm's schedule, and at 10:15 a.m. Genevieve Lockhartvale arrived in her Pearl SUV leading a convoy, 3 prospective buyers, an appraiser, a videographer, the whole circus, because she planned to parade them past my industrial eyesore, film their disgust, then use it as evidence that I was hurting property values, and she didn't realize my signs would guide them into the entrance of my container maze like a polite invitation to their own undoing. They followed the signs perfectly, because people follow signs when they assume the world is honest, and once they crossed the point where turning around meant scraping paint, they were committed, and I watched brake lights stutter, watched the path narrow, watched the first faint metal scrape, and then, beautiful physics, Genevieve's SUV rolled onto the pressure plate, counterweights engaged, and the entry gate swung shut with a heavy clang that sounded like a courtroom gavel in steel form. Trapped. Luxury cars boxed in by rusted walls, the kind of walls money can't argue with. Minutes later, county inspector arrived for the scheduled permit check, then a sheriff's deputy responding to a traffic obstruction, then a local news crew that Dorothy Hensley had quietly tipped off, and suddenly the property value tour became a live exhibit of HOA overreach, trespass, and arrogance. I walked to the edge of my property line, spread out the 1987 survey maps, the buffer zone designation, and pointed at the fountain, calm voice, camera ready. That fountain you keep showing off. It sits on my land. 5 years, no easement, no lease, no permission. Then I held up my phone and played Carlos Mendez's recording of Genevieve offering cash to sabotage my containers. And you could feel the air change, because everyone understands that moment when a bully's power evaporates and all that's left is the bare fact of what they did. The deputy listened, face hardening, asked for copies. The inspector verified property lines, nodded slowly like a man realizing paperwork just became a wrecking ball, and the news reporter's eyes lit up because she knew this wasn't HOA drama. It was a story about sacred ground being violated for profit. Fire department came with a crane truck to lift vehicles out, one by one. And as each car was hoisted over the container walls, the symbolism got louder. Rich people literally being lifted out of a trap created by their own entitlement. And Genevieve Lockhart-Vale rolled her window down with that last desperate attempt at authority, claiming harassment, claiming unfairness. And the deputy said something simple that landed like a verdict. "Ma'am, you're on his property without permission. That's trespassing, not harassment." And for the first time I watched her realize she couldn't clipboard her way out of consequences. By the end of the week, she resigned from the committee to pursue other opportunities. The law firm backed down. The HOA held an emergency meeting with residents packed in like they were finally allowed to breathe, and the new interim board agreed to a settlement, damages for the hedge wall and memorial roses, reimbursement for legal costs, and most importantly, a formal property rights agreement recognizing my buffer zone protections and my deed exemptions, and the fountain, they're precious. Centerpiece, stayed, but under a paid easement, $200 a month plus back rent. Because if you're going to stand on my land and take photos for your magazine dreams, you're going to pay for the ground you thought you owned. I rebuilt the memorial inside the container courtyard, not hidden, not vulnerable, 3 rows bushes planted in raised beds, names engraved on a simple steel plaque I welded myself. And every morning when I water them, I feel something like peace, not because the past stops hurting, but because the past is finally respected. And here's the closure nobody expects. The fortress didn't just protect me. It woke the neighborhood up, because once people saw Genevieve fall, others started speaking, butterfly gardens destroyed, wheelchair ramps cited, work vans fined, families squeezed until they complied, and the board had to change. Transparency policies implemented, open session votes required, appeal processes enforced, because fear only survives in silence, and silence doesn't survive when someone builds a wall strong enough to echo truth back at the people who caused it. So that's my story. A memorial garden chainsawed for a scenic shot, a rusted container fortress raised in response, a bully exposed by surveys, audio, and the laws she assumed nobody would read, and a quiet corner lot turned in to a place where my brothers' names can bloom without being touched by anyone's community vision. Now I'll ask you one thing, and I want you to sit with it honestly, because it's not just about HOAs. It's about ethics, power, and what we owe the dead. If someone destroys something sacred to you for profit and control, and you answer not with violence, not with begging, but with a trap built from law, engineering, and patience, is that revenge? Or is that justice done right? And if it is justice, how far is too far before it becomes the same kind of cruelty you were fighting?